Okay, welcome. So today is our Move into Stillness meeting, and let's get started. So this is an exploration of somatics and how it can help you. So we'll start with who is somatics for? Well, if you have a body and you have a nervous system, the nervous system is the more important of the two, but you kind of need a body too. So both equally important, I guess. But if you have those two things, you're a very good candidate. If you're human, then you're a shoo-in for sure. It's for you, and that might seem like, I don't know, too convenient that it would be for anybody who's human, but it actually turns out that it's true, and so I'll explain to you why that is in a moment. What can somatics do for you? So what somatics can do for you is that it helps you to reawaken the somatic awareness, which allows you to let go of limiting patterns in your nervous system, specifically in the somatic nervous system, although it can also be indirectly useful for other types of patterns, but very specifically in the somatic nervous system. And that means that you will experience greater freedom and ease. Specifically, you can expect to experience greater freedom and ease in your movement, but it just starts there and continues to radiate outward, because everything more or less in the human experience, at least in our waking state, day-to-day activities, is under the influence quite heavily of the somatic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system is it's just a term that's used by people who are interested in describing a part of an aspect of our experience. And let me just, there was a thing that I want to close that. Okay, that's closed. So this is just a way of describing. So we say that we have an autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is certain aspect of our nervous system that regulates things like temperature, blood pressure, things of that nature, heart rate, so forth and so on. We also talk about having a peripheral nervous system and a central nervous system. So central nervous system is your brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is sort of everything else that's not the central nervous system, that is part of the nervous system. So anything that involves nerves that's not the brain or central nervous system would be peripheral nervous system. So somatic nervous system just refers to, it's just another way of kind of describing a certain aspect of the nervous system. And it has to do with sensation and motor control. And so you might think, well, that's interesting, sensation and motor control. Obviously that has a lot to do with movement, but it also has a lot to do with a lot of other things. So it turns out that anytime that we're experiencing a feeling, in a sense, that's the somatic nervous system. And a lot of things that we wouldn't think of as movement, nonetheless, are in fact movement. So for example, speaking is a movement. So these are things that, it's a huge range of things under the domain of the somatic nervous system, things that we are wanting to do successfully every day. And yet there are limitations. We experience those limitations in a variety of ways. The most obvious way that we experience those limitations is restrictions in movement or pain. So who doesn't have some of that? Anybody over the age of 5 probably has some of that, and probably most people, even from birth, have some degree of limitation in range of movement and some kind of discomfort, chronic discomfort or pain. And so this is like the great mystery of to humanity for such a long time. There's this, the riddle of the Sphinx, this ancient riddle. What is it that, see if I can remember how it goes. Like, what is it that sometimes I'm going to butcher it, but what is it sometimes walks on 4 legs and sometimes walks on 2 legs and sometimes walks on 3 legs? And of course, the answer is human, because the notion is, and this is even in ancient times, that obviously, early on crawling, so 4, and then standing upright and walking on 2, but then as the expectation culturally is that as one ages, one loses function and physical function, but all kinds of functions. So this is what Thomas Hanna was most specifically addressing when he was very adamant about this myth of aging. So Thomas Hanna is one of the big names in the field of somatics, and one of my, he died before I had the chance to really learn about somatics, but nonetheless one of my teachers, in the sense of I've learned a great deal from him. And so he talked a great deal about the myth of aging. And so this notion, even in ancient times, that aging equals loss of function, Hanna says this is incorrect. This is a misunderstanding. And of course, he's not alone in this. Since ancient times also, there have been those who've known this. They didn't have the same, they didn't describe it in the same language. They didn't have the same techniques, but nonetheless, ancient Taoist masters practicing Qigong and so forth, yogic, great yogis, all these people knew in some way about what Thomas Hanna was describing when he described somatics. And so this is, at the same time, it's ancient and yet modern knowledge. It's always been that a minority have known about this, but part of my mission is to make this information more widely available, because I believe that this is anybody who is human, it is your birthright to have this information and to know how to put it into practice so that you can help yourself, your friends, your family, and loved ones, because you don't have to live with those limitations. There is a solution. There absolutely is a solution, and it really comes down to knowing what the actual problem is. Before I talk about what the problem is and what the solution is, though, I mean, obviously the solution is somatics, but you don't necessarily know what that entails. But before I get into that, I want to also just take another moment just to talk about how this also affects other things in our lives, because as I alluded to, it's not just what we would consider to be limitations in physical range of movement and physical pain or discomfort. It also extends to other, what we would consider to be other aspects of our life, such as our emotions, our feelings, even our thinking. It turns out that thinking is good reason to believe that thinking is in fact just something that we do, or it's just sort of a byproduct of our socializing, our socialization, which is if not entirely, largely under the domain of the somatic nervous system. It involves sensation and motor control. When we are engaged in social interactions, we're having to, there's a very complex process in which we're monitoring and controlling our behavior so that it will be socially acceptable. That cuts both ways. Obviously, we are a social species, social organism. Humans can't really live by themselves. So we depend upon our social structure and social organization. And so navigating that complexity is essential to what it is to be human. And we need to be successful at that. And that means that, sometimes you have a strong feeling or strong reaction to something that somebody is saying or doing, and maybe without proper socialization, the first response or reaction would be to physically assault the person. But fortunately for us, hopefully everybody here has learned adequate social skills to know how to manage their behavior so that they don't do those kinds of things, even though the impulse may be there. So that's really important for our well-being. But as I say, it cuts both ways, because what that means is we're often left to our own devices in order to figure out how to do that. It turns out that there are many different strategies, but all of them involve some degree of, not all, many of them involve some kind of tension, because it's a restraint. That's probably one of the most common strategies that people develop for social regulation, is tension or restraint. And so there's an impulse, and we keep that in check through restraint. Okay, so it's better not to indulge those violent impulses, but the strategy that we use could often use some improvement. So the point here is that an enormous amount of what we're dealing with when we're dealing with anxiety, I'm not necessarily going to say that all anxiety falls under the domain of the somatic nervous system. Some of that can be autonomic, but a very significant amount of it, probably the vast majority, actually is a somatic issue. And it really comes down to not knowing how it is that we don't have the awareness of what it is that we're doing that's producing the experience that we're having. And so we just call it anxiety because we don't know what it really is. This is not in any way to diminish the impact or the difficulty of experiencing anxiety. Even once it's recognized for what it really is, it can still be quite challenging, but that's the first step, is to correctly identify what it is in the first place before we can, we have to know correctly what it is before we can apply the correct remedy. So knowing that it's a somatic issue is a very, very important first step. And then we need to know what we can do about it. So now we can talk about broadly what the problem is somatically. And Hannah calls this sensory motor amnesia. Now, of course, many of you have been here before, and so you might want to kind of start, you might think you're free to check out, but actually it's very helpful to continue to pay attention, because the more you're exposed to this, the more that it will sink in, the more you'll see just how profoundly important this knowledge is. And you'll start to see how it applies to your life in so many different ways. So sensory motor amnesia is pretty much just what the term describes, but since it's a new term, probably requires a little bit of, or somewhat new for many of us, we need a little bit of explanation. So you'll recall the somatic nervous system is involved in both sensation and motor control. Okay, so what this is saying is that we've forgotten how to accurately sense and to voluntarily have motor control. Now, obviously, the degree of sensory motor amnesia can vary widely. So just because you have sensory motor amnesia does not mean that you have no function. You could have an enormous amount of function and still have sensory motor amnesia, just a relatively small amount, or you could have an enormous amount of sensory motor amnesia, in which case your function will be greatly limited, but you're going to fall somewhere on that spectrum. So this sensory motor amnesia means, just like I said, that you've forgotten, consciously, you've forgotten how to properly interpret the sensations that your nervous system is producing and receiving. And you have lost, temporarily at least, the ability to have voluntary motor control over certain things. What this means typically is that some muscles in your body are chronically tight. Now, that chronic tension in the muscles is going to be sending a constant feedback to your nervous system, to the central nervous system, saying it's a signal. It's just a signal. And but the proper interpretation of the signal is just as simple as this muscle is tight. And that is because this nervous system is continuing to send the signal to hold that muscle tight. So it's an important point here that I don't think I've really emphasized this in the past, so I want to emphasize it now because it's a very important point, that your muscles don't do anything by themselves. The only reason your muscles do anything is because your nervous system sends a signal. So that might seem trivial, but I assure you, it's very important. So I want to look at that a little bit more closely and what the implications of that are. So we do know that, for example, if when a person dies, when the body dies, then there's a period of rigor mortis, and that's just some energetic and biological processes doing their thing. But once that is concluded, then the muscles go flaccid. So the person could have severe sensory motor amnesia and be holding an enormous amount of tension, and at some point relatively quickly after death, after rigor mortis has ceased, then the muscles become flaccid. So why is that? Well, I mean, obviously they're dead, but what are the implications of that? When death occurs, then the nervous system the central nervous system is no longer sending any messages out to the periphery. So the muscles are no longer getting any signals to notify them to have tension. And of course, then because the muscles don't do anything on their own, the muscles cease having tension. So this is interesting because this has enormous implications for us when we're living. The good news is with somatics, we don't have to wait until we're dead in order to have relaxed muscles. Now, when the muscles are chronically tense, you understand you have to really see what's going on here, because this is sensory motor amnesia. I guarantee you have chronically tight muscles, some of them that you know about, some of them that you don't know about. And these chronically tight muscles are, they're fiber, they're nerve attachments, okay? Nerve attachments into the muscles, and these are sending back signals from the periphery to the central nervous system constantly, notifying the central nervous system this muscle has tension. Remember though, in sensory motor amnesia, the problem is that your nervous system, your central nervous system, is no longer properly interpreting those signals. So it's getting the signal, but you're no longer consciously able to interpret that what the signal means is that the muscle is tight. Instead, what you're interpreting that signal as, anything could be anything. But this is why you end up with things like chronic pain, discomfort, restricted movement, anxiety, frustration, other kinds of experiences that you don't like, because you're getting a signal. Imagine constant signal, constant noise, constantly, all the time. Your nervous system doesn't like that. It wants to be able to do something about it, but it's forgotten what this noise means, and by the way, even if you realize what the noise means consciously, which can happen sometimes because you could consciously discover, oh yeah, that muscle is tight. But notice what happens is that when you discover that you have a chronically tight muscle, like, let's say your hamstrings, because everybody seems to have chronically tight hamstrings. Well, it's so normalized. Everybody has it. There's these sort of cultural myths around it, like that somehow makes sense. Like somehow that just happens, that just the muscles just somehow start getting tight. Muscles don't get tight on their own. Muscles get tight because the brain is telling them to tense up. But people don't realize this. So even when they get the proper interpretation of the signal, at least partially, then they still don't know how to stop doing it. So this is the other part, which is the voluntary motor control. So motor control means the ability to voluntarily change the tension of the muscles from 0 to 100 and back to 0, anywhere in that range, voluntarily, anytime. So the fact that most people don't know how to do that demonstrates that most people are struggling with sensory motor amnesia. So you think about, a lot of people have these ideas about the benefits of stretching. Well, turns out that's incorrect. Oh, no, wait a second, before you freak out, because I know, maybe you've got a daily stretching routine or whatever. And you might say, well, wait, sometimes I'm getting benefits from my stretching routine. Well, great, good for you. But here's the better news. There's a more direct, more efficient way to get those benefits and to get more of those benefits. Because when you get those benefits by quote unquote stretching, you're not getting the benefits because of stretching. That I can promise you, and I'll explain that in more detail just in a moment. The reason that you get the benefits when you're doing what you consider to be stretching, and notice that they're hit or miss, or at the very least they're short-lived, is that you're getting them by accident, because you're accidentally accidentally employing some somatic techniques. You don't know you're doing it, because if you knew you were doing it, then you would do it more efficiently and you get better results. But nonetheless, when these things work, whether it's massage or yoga or stretching or whatever, they're working in one. I could say broadly, we can categorize it as one of two ways. One way is it's on accident, you're employing some somatic technique. You don't know you're doing it, but you are on accident and you get the benefit accidentally. More commonly, it's because it's rather than addressing the somatic nervous system, which is what really is needed, it ends up indirectly shifting the state of the autonomic nervous system, for example, which can have some downstream effects, but they'll be short-lived because you're not specifically addressing what it is, where the actual problem exists. So now let's talk about how you can correct this. So you hopefully have made it clear that many of these problems that you're struggling with, I'm not saying all problems that you're struggling with, but a lot of them. Anything that's involving, let's say, to put a number on it, I would estimate that at least 90%, if not more, of chronic physical pain or discomfort are the result of sensory motor amnesia, and probably 100% or very close to 100% of all restricted movements or restricted range of motion are the result of sensory motor amnesia. Percentages, I'm not sure what the percentages are, but at least better than half of cases of chronic anxiety, especially social anxiety, are the result of sensory motor amnesia. Many uh, here's another thing that you could consider. Any kind of emotional state, in this case, we're talking about an unwanted or negative emotional state or a sensation that you experience conditionally, but chronically, is almost certain to be caused by sensory motor amnesia. So what I mean by that is, if there are certain conditions, like when you're stressed or when you're rushed or when you're, uh, when there's something, whatever, so something along those lines, if there's some kind of condition like that, or a certain person triggers this, it's almost certain to be sensory motor amnesia, because what that indicates is that you're doing something that involves some kind of activity, motor activity, maybe low level motor activity, but nonetheless, that you're not properly interpreting or understanding or even aware of. And so it's a sensory motor amnesia issue. Okay, so broad scope of problems that are caused by sensory motor amnesia that are affecting you every single day of your life. Wouldn't you like to be able to correct that and enter somatics? So now, how do we apply somatics, or what's the practical application? So in a sense, all of this knowledge is essential and it is practical in the sense that you have to know this, and you have to be convinced of the problem and the nature of the problem, the sensory motor amnesia, before you're going to be receptive to and then be willing to actually utilize the correct remedy, because otherwise you'll look for other things, which we all have. We all know that, you look to this, that, and the other, so many different things that you can try that don't work. They haven't worked for you, at least. Maybe they worked for your neighbor, maybe they worked for your sister, maybe they worked for whoever, but they haven't worked for you. All the things that you've tried so far, if you tried them sincerely and they haven't given you lasting results, they weren't addressing what it is that's really going on. So now, in order to remedy this, the solution is, it should be kind of obvious, but let's just break it down a little bit. So the problem is sensory motor amnesia, meaning you've forgotten. Now, the capacity exists within you because you're human. You have this miraculous capacity. It's not just humans, by the way, but humans, I think, are the only ones who can do it self-directed, sort of. Other species do use somatics or somatic practices, but they can't choose it. And they do it instinctively. And so if their instinct can help them, then great. But if their instinct is not able to remedy the specific issue, they're out of luck, unless a human who has the knowledge is willing and able to help them out, which can work with domesticated animals sometimes, not so well for wild animals, because I'm not interested in trying to, I'm very interested, but I'm not presently going to try to help rehabilitate a wild lion, for example, who has some kind of sensory motor amnesia that he or she can't remedy on their own. But back to you as a human. So the good news is that you actually do have the ability to correct any sensory motor amnesia that you presently have or ever will have. In order to do that, of course, requires that you apply yourself to it and practice and learn and discover and become more skillful and eventually masterful. So I'm not proposing it's like put a Band-Aid on it and it's corrected overnight, because some things are quite complicated. There's some things are, well, some things can be very complicated. There's the human nervous system is enormously complicated. I don't even know how many trillions of nerve cells there are, but there's a lot of them. And the capacity for neuroplasticity is huge. And then we have so many muscles, and so, it can be very complex. It can also be very simple. It depends. Okay. But the good news is back to the solution. The solution clearly, if the problem is that you have amnesia, the solution is to remember, right? So Hannah calls this simply sensory motor awareness. I think that's great in terms of it's clear, but unfortunately, sensory motor amnesia and sensory motor awareness both have the same acronym, which is SMA. So maybe we need a different term for the remedy. But how do we cultivate this awareness? Well, we utilize our knowledge of, in this case, the nervous system, in order to help ourselves. So as I've said, there are ancient techniques. Many of them are, just because they're ancient doesn't mean they may not be more advanced than modern techniques. But maybe in some of those cases, they're so advanced that we are not presently advanced enough to make use of them properly. So we want the technology and the knowledge that is accessible to us. And so for us, modern day humans, one of, if not the most accessible and effective ways to remedy it is to utilize the principles of somatic movement that I will define for you, and then to couple that with optimal somatic exercises, which we will not get into the optimal somatic exercises today, but don't worry, because that doesn't mean that you won't be able to benefit immediately. You will, because the most important thing is the principles of somatic movement. That is essential. And without the principles, you could do the so-called optimal somatic exercises all day long, and you would only make things worse. Why? Because, well, if you don't already know, it will be clear, I think, once I explain the principles. Okay. So could Qigong work? Yes, absolutely. Could yoga work? Yes, absolutely. Could fill in the blank work? Probably. Depends on what it is that we're filling the blank in with, but many things could work. And as I said, some of them may even be more advanced than what I'm going to share with you today. But the thing is, have they worked for you adequately up to now? And if not, then what you need is something that is accessible and to you, and that it will work for you. And so when you apply the somatic movement principles, you will get results. Why? Because these principles are based on some understanding that we have of the human nervous system. And I can't really take credit for any of this. It's not my discovery. I mean, I have my own personal discovery of it, which I share with you, because it's through my own work with the work that I have insights that I can share with you that will help you to get better results. But in terms of the knowledge of the nervous system, that didn't originate from me, but I can share it with you and it will help you. So the first most important thing is to understand that we are wanting to, in order to apply correct somatic movement principles, we need to make the movement conscious, right? So remember, the problem is sensory motor amnesia. Now we think it's all kinds of other things, right? I mean, you've got all kinds of other names for it. And this is a big part of the hurdle for many people, is that you have to be willing to let go of the things that are hopeless or that haven't worked for you, right? Because a lot of the times we have names for our symptoms or experiences, that end up being disempowering and hopeless, right? So if you've got a name or a story for your symptoms or your experience, and the name or the story is one that is essentially hopeless for you because it says, well, I'm a victim, something happened to me in the past and now that's done. Or I'm a victim because I've got this thing that has this name and it's incurable. Or I'm a victim because I have this condition that has this name, or maybe it doesn't have a name, but it's a mystery and nobody knows what to do. And millions of people have this condition, but nobody ever gets better. Well, then you can't really expect that it will be much more challenging for you to fully commit to the practices that will actually work to help you, right? Because you have to commit, you have to apply yourself, it's a learning process. You have to learn so many things and you have to unlearn so many things. And that takes some time and patience and commitment. It doesn't take forever. This is the fastest, most direct method that I am aware of for addressing the somatic nervous system, which will help with, as I've already described, an enormous range of symptoms. But, and it can sometimes work very, very rapidly and give lasting results very rapidly. But more often than not, it requires some commitment and patience. And so and ultimately, even once you get those results, you have to understand that the development of sensory motor amnesia is sort of built into the human experience, but we have now the remedy. So once you develop skill with it, it's a skill you're going to want to use for life because it will help you for the rest of your life. Okay, so now remember, sensory motor amnesia is the problem. So in order to remedy that, really what we have to do is make what's been forgotten remembered, which means it has to be conscious. So the nervous system, the brain, is still sending the signals to the muscles saying, tense up, tense up, tense up, tense up. I don't know how often it does that, probably 1,000 times a second. It keeps sending that signal. And so the muscle complies because that's what it does. But that's no longer conscious. So the amnesia, in this case, it's not like there was brain damage and that knowledge or skill was completely lost forever. What's actually happened is this form of amnesia is just that you no longer have conscious voluntary access, but you can regain that because what's happened is that signal and all of the processing is still going on, obviously, because the muscles are still tense. So the brain is still sending the signal, but it's happening lower down in the brain. Lower down, lower meaning more in the direction of the brainstem versus being in the frontal cortex. So when there's activity in the frontal cortex, that corresponds to or correlates to conscious volitional activity. And when the activity is further down toward the brainstem, that's unconscious activity. So this sensory motor amnesia is still involving a great deal of processing by the brain, but it's happening lower down. And so it's unconscious, but we can make it conscious. How do we do that? So first principle of somatic movement is slow down. Because slowing down is like what do people call these things? Biohacks. Okay, so it's a biohack because the unconscious portions of the nervous system we know some things about the unconscious. Unconscious activity is of the nervous system is relative to the conscious activity is very fast. So in order to sort of, it's a biohack to produce consciousness, to produce conscious activity, simply slow down. how much do you have to slow down? As much as required in order to make it conscious. That is a variable. It depends on the individual and the circumstances and so forth. So for some people, that's just a little slow. And for some people, that's very slow. But there is some threshold that for you in this moment, if you slow the activity down to that much or slower, it becomes conscious. So that's the first, in a sense, is the most. If you only remembered one thing, that's the so simple, and it's very powerful. It will help you enormously. Is that going to give you an instant cure? Probably not. So you have to have realistic expectations, because if you expect, okay, I'm going to slow down, I'm going to slow way down, I'm going to slow way down, and I'm going to do it for 5 minutes. And then after the 5 minutes, you said, well, I slowed way down and it didn't work. Okay. But you have to keep doing that. And I'll talk about some more parameters for how to do that successfully, but you have to have the correct expectation. Otherwise, you'll abandon ship before you get the results. So you really, my guarantee to you, my promise to you is, and my goal with this is to convince you of this fact, that this is that you have this problem of sensory motor amnesia, that this problem of sensory motor amnesia is a significant problem that is impacting you in so many ways, and that resolving this problem will help you. Okay, that this is what should be one of your big priorities. Should be, if you're serious about wanting to feel better, if you're serious about wanting to be more productive, if you're serious about wanting to be happier, if you're serious about wanting to have a better life, then this should be a high priority for you, because it correctly identifies the problem, and it is the most accessible and efficient solution to that problem that I'm aware of. So that's my goal, is to convince you that that is all so. But you also then have to continue to apply yourself, and it's worth it. Absolutely worth it, beyond doubt. And many of you know that, I mean, many of you have reported that you've had very good experiences. So you know that firsthand. And in that case, you also know this surprising, maybe surprising thing that we do, which is that we can have some amazing revelatory transformation that's lasting, where we regain function, regain freedom, ease of movement, range of motion, and feel better, have more confidence, and so forth and so on. And then 5 minutes later, we say, So we have to be aware of that as well, okay? Because this is just a very important thing. And, one way to help yourself with that is keep a journal. Keep a journal, keep it simple. Don't make it unsustainable, but if you keep a journal, just do a simple 1-line entry each day for your somatic journal. Then you can go back and you can see the evidence, oh yeah, I had, I forgot how miserable I was, but look here, I was that miserable, and now look, day after day, I got results, and those results have lasted. This really works. You have to help yourself in that way. You want to set yourself up for success. So, but the first most important principle for somatic movement is slow down, slow down. And second principle that is going to help you tremendously is that you want to give as much as possible your undivided 100% focus to the movement and how you are doing the movement, and that will also help you. So this also is a biohack. In much the same way as the first one, because the unconscious is great multitasker. So, and this is essential because you consider, your autonomic nervous system is is for most people, other than advanced yogis, it's involuntary. It's unconscious. You're not aware of the sending the signals to beat the heart. You're not aware of sending the signals to control your blood pressure and so forth and so on. That's all happening unconsciously, and which is good. It's very, very good, because there's a story. I don't know if this is a true story, but I remember hearing the story about this yogi who had developed the ability to voluntarily beat his own heart, but then he forgot to beat his own heart and forgot to turn that back over to unconscious control, and then his heart stopped beating. So whether it's true or not, I don't know, but interesting story and cautionary tale, I suppose, whether it's true or not. So but all that, we want that to be unconscious by and large, because who wants to be, you talk about a panic attack. Imagine if you suddenly realized that you had to beat your heart all the time consciously. It would be awful. So we're very happy and grateful and thankful that our hearts are beating without us having to do it consciously. So you should even actually just take a moment sincerely to have gratitude for your unconscious, because it's an enormous blessing. It's what allows you to be here in this and have this human experience. So it's a huge blessing. And we want to know some things about this unconscious. We already know one thing, which is that it's very fast relative to the conscious. Another thing is, as I've already hinted, it can multitask. So it can beat your heart, it can control the blood pressure, and regulate the pH in your blood within a very small range, because you spend just a few seconds outside of that very tight range of pH in your blood, you die. And you would feel really bad while you were dying too. Many, many things all the time, constantly being controlled, temperature, and your digestion and everything. All of these things are going on. And many things that are not part of the autonomic nervous system, they're actually part of the somatic nervous system, but they've become unconscious. So they're in the unconscious portion of the somatic nervous system. And these are the things that we've learned to do, from tying the shoes to how you get back home from work or from the store or whatever. You notice that sometimes these habits just are there and they run your life, and like sometimes you're going somewhere and then you end up taking a different turn because you're not accustomed to going to that place, and you're just doing the thing that's automatic. All of these things that we do, talking, walking, writing, reading, how you brush your teeth, all these things they've become unconscious. So that's why when things are conscious, when you're learning something, you can only really do that one thing. The kind of classic example is, if you recall learning to drive a car, then when you first were learning to drive a car, it required all of your focus. But after it became unconscious activity, then you could drive the car and listen to the radio and have a conversation and text, and don't text while you're driving. But you can do all these different things all at the same time. It may not be safe, but you can do it. And the reason you can do it is because they're unconscious. Okay. So this is great. Of course, the only problem is if you have sensory motor amnesia, which means that you have some kind of unconscious pattern that's playing out, some kind of unconscious sensory motor activity that that's not efficient. It's not what you want. So it's limiting you, it's restricting you, it's causing you to experience pain and frustration and so forth and so on. So we want to make that conscious so we can establish a different pattern. We want to erase that inefficient pattern and introduce a new efficient pattern that is what we experience as pleasurable and joyful and so forth. So what does this mean? If the unconscious is multitasking, what does this tell us about the conscious nervous system? It does one thing at a time. So you cannot, it's just simply a fact, you cannot multitask. You cannot consciously multitask. It's not a possibility. You can only do one thing at a time consciously. So knowing this, we have now this other biohack, which is you give your full undivided attention to this. So how do you do that in a practical sense? That means that you make the commitment consciously. I am choosing to do this movement consciously, to give my full undivided attention to how I do the movement, the quality of the movement, and my experience of the movement, and every detail that I can become conscious of for, and then however long you decide. At first, not going to be very long. You'll be surprised. I mean, if you have experience meditating, for example, depending on the type of meditation, but really kind of any meditation in a sense, if you have experience meditating, you know from that experience that you space out. You can't seem to keep your conscious focus on anything for very long. It's a skill that you can develop. There are modern day ways, there are ancient yogic techniques. Probably the most direct and effective technique is simply to just practice keeping your attention on something. You just practice keeping your focus on something. So great news is somatics, when you employ the somatic movement principles, not only is it going to help you to resolve the problem of sensory motor amnesia, it's also going to help you to be more one-pointed, to have focus, concentration, to be clear on what you want and to achieve that. So hopefully it's obvious why that's beneficial. So huge benefits just from this one thing, but you have to do it. And you have to understand going into it that your skill level is going to be low relative to what you want it to be. You might find you can only keep your attention, your conscious focus on this for a few seconds, and that might be kind of frustrating at first. So you set yourself a realistic kind of stretch goal, meaning outside of if you're practicing this and you find, holy cow, 5 seconds and I'm spaced out consistently, all I can do is 5 seconds, then you say, okay, that's not, I'm glad to know this. I'm glad to have this revelation, because this shows me exactly why I'm having all these struggles in my life, because all I can manage is to keep my conscious attention on something for 5 seconds. Well, imagine how good my life will be when I can remain focused on something for longer than that. Because you need to be able to do that to see anything through, anything that you want. You have to be able to keep your conscious attention on it for long enough. So how do you develop that skill? Well, practice, practice, practice. And you don't set unrealistic, unreasonable, well, a little bit unreasonable, but not unrealistic goals for yourself. So if you can only do 5 seconds at a time, don't say, I'm going to do 10 minutes, because you're not. But you could set a goal for yourself. You say, for 1 minute, I'm going to keep my focus. I'm going to keep bringing my focus back. Okay. And then once you seem to be able to get better at that, maybe you can't keep your focus for an entire minute, but maybe you find you can keep your focus for 30 seconds, more or less. You're not obviously watching the clock, but something along, you get a sense of, yeah, I'm getting better at this. Great, now you can increase that. Now try 2 minutes, try 5 minutes, up to 10 minutes. Do not exceed 10 minutes. Why? Because you'll get, especially at this point, you'll get diminishing returns. And eventually you'll start to negate the benefits because you'll exhaust yourself, and you'll actually, in that time, what will happen is you'll lose what it is that you've learned, and you won't get the repatterning. So less is more in that sense. But up to 10 minutes. The key here is that it's very important that when you experience fatigue, not necessarily muscular fatigue, but just nervous system fatigue, where you feel like, I can't do it anymore. I can't keep my focus. I just feel kind of spacey. And you can't bring your attention back without it being too much of a strain, that you must stop then. Very, very important. If you abuse your willpower, you will only hurt yourself. You will deplete yourself, and you will not benefit in the way that you would benefit if you really respect this guideline. So remember, a lot of this is about learning about yourself, because you're learning about your habits, you're learning about your patterns. It's the ways that you do things, and you want to improve upon that. So you're just, don't push. Okay, so another, and we'll conclude with this one because we're at time today, but this is another important principle for somatic movement, is that you are gentle. So is gentleness a biohack? I don't know. Probably, but I don't know the mechanism. All I know is that it's very, very, very important. Okay, so those are the main principles. So you need to remember those three things. So please write those down so that you can remember them. You want to write them down, because otherwise you'll forget. But if you write them down and you read them before you do your somatic movement practice, then you're going to be much more likely to remember. And they're so important. In fact, you really shouldn't do any somatic movement practice. And let me just say, you really shouldn't do any movement. Well, no, that's not true. Because there's definitely many movements that should be done unconsciously, but you shouldn't do any movement that's not optimized to your liking without employing those principles. Okay, so anytime that you want to do something well, or that you want to improve some movement, or you want to learn how to feel better, you need to employ those principles. So you want to write those down and read them to remind yourself prior to any of those kinds of activities. That would include, if you're still wanting to do stretching, you got to remember those principles, because those are without those, you need to know that you could actually, if you're aggressive in stretching, you can end up hurting yourself. And that can be actually quite serious damage, because before you're going to stretch your muscles, you're going to end up stretching tendons. So you don't actually want to stretch. You can call it stretching if you really want to, but you need to start thinking of it as lengthening, not stretching. Voluntarily releasing and lengthening, not stretching, because stretching would be forceful. And there's a mechanism in your nervous system that prevents that. And your muscles are incredibly strong. You have no idea how strong your muscles are. They can, when they're working to their fullest capacity, they can do things that you can only dream of. But they will do those things if you force them. And if you stress the nervous system, you can force that, and you'll end up stretching something that you don't want to stretch. So much better to think of it as voluntarily lengthening and releasing muscles. And then you employ these three principles. So what are they? Slow, focused, gentle. You remember those three things, you will have very good success. Perhaps not overnight, but when you apply them consistently, it will change your life for the better. You will experience so many benefits Again, please don't think that you must start always moving super slowly, because that's not true. But anytime that you have an experience that is not adequately pleasing to you, that involves any kind of movement, then you owe it to yourself to employ these three principles, because they will, given a persistent application over hours, days, weeks, months, you will see very significant benefits, and you won't hurt yourself. So it's very, very important. Let me see if there's anything I want to say in conclusion before we wrap up. Oh my goodness, I could say so many things, but we'll leave it at that. So use those principles. Please write them down so you can remember, because these can help you so much. They go against a lot of what the cultural conditioning is. So the cultural conditioning says you must, everything's urgent and you got to do everything right now, and you've got to do it all. There's a lot of pressure, and you're supposed to be fast, and you're supposed to look good according to whatever that social construct is. And so a lot of those things are working against this, because if you're truly slowing down with focus and you're being gentle, then let me just add one more note about it. With a focus, or with your intention, is to soften, release, and lengthen, so that you can experience greater ease and lightness of being. Okay, so when you really honestly do that, you're not gonna necessarily, in fact, you're almost certainly not going to match your inner model or image of what you should look like or should be doing, because your gut's going to hang out, and you're not going to put on the false front that you've learned, that you've adopted in order to try and get by in this culture. But you owe it to yourself to do more than get by. You owe it to yourself to thrive. And that is possible, but you have to make that choice. And it really means going counter to your existing conditioning. So, start out in private, so that you can allow yourself that luxury, I guess, of shouldn't be a luxury, but you allow yourself that you can you don't have to be sucking in your gut. You don't have to have what you think of as good posture. You don't have to, any of these things that are so ingrained into you through habit and through fear and whatnot. You want to set yourself up for success. So you want to be in a space where you don't have those kinds of concerns, and you can really let it all hang out. And you cannot be so concerned about presenting a particular image to anyone, because this is all of that's what's keeping you stuck, because all of that involves a lot of muscular tension. And I'll finish it by saying this, because there's good news in this. When you really stop doing all those things, which is a process, and you have to continue to practice and explore with these principles, but you'll discover that you feel so much better, and you'll actually start looking better. Okay, not just in a way that will be undeniable to everybody. You'll glow. You'll exude confidence. You will. People will be very attracted to you, because you'll be true to yourself. You'll be feeling good, and you'll be only interested in being truthful and in honoring that and in expressing that. And it is the most blissful, joyful, wonderful thing. And everybody will find that very attractive, except for those who find it threatening. But in order to get there, you have to be willing to let go of the things that are binding you. And those are just your own habits that you took on innocently, but you have to be willing to let them go. And so give yourself that space, find a comfortable, safe space for you where you can let go and start to explore your own experience and utilizing these principles. And then I do intend, I know I said that was the last thing, just one last kind of announcement, which is I do intend, I guess once I say it, I'm committing to it. Okay, so I do intend to create a more in-depth, a new, more in-depth somatic training that will give you more practical instruction on the optimal somatic exercises so that you can also utilize those. So I don't want to leave you high and dry in that sense, but start practicing with these somatic movement principles. And that's going to set the stage because it's going to give you such a leg up. You'll see once you actually get the hang of these things, and then we start utilizing the optimized somatic exercises, it's going to be, it will be such an enormous positive change, positive transformation, because you'll have laid the groundwork for it. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining. I really appreciate you. I appreciate you taking the time and having interest in this because, as I said, it's part of my mission to get this information to everybody. I mean, that's a big mission for one person, so I can't do that on my own. But that's why I'm sharing this with you, because I want you to learn it. I want you to gain that kind of self-mastery and to have that kind of depth of knowledge and experience so that you can, in your own way, share it with the people who you love and care about, and your friends and neighbors and community and so forth. Because I really see that if we all do that, and I'm not saying you need to go proselytize today, one step at a time, you get the benefits for yourself. But once you're getting those benefits and you start to really know it, then of course I want you to share that with other people so they can have those benefits too. And you share your own experience. You say, look, these are the things that I'm discovering. This is how it's helped me. These are all the benefits that I'm experiencing. Other people are going to want that too. And I believe together we can get this information into every household, everywhere, every school. I think that every workplace, everybody should have this information because it's essential for being human in the most abundantly joyous way. So thank you again. Blessings to you all, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.